Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's speaker is Dr. Tanja Schneider. She's the head of the Human-Centered Innovation section at the Technological University of Denmark and an associate professor of science and technology studies. I'm so glad that she accepted the invitation to give a presentation today. She's going to talk about an app that she developed with others to support users with their food shopping behavior and dietary choices. The title of her presentation, and you see it on the first slide, is Trusting the Algorithm, the Challenge of Delegating Dietary Expertise to an Automated System. Welcome, Tanja. The floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for inviting me and the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to present this research that I've been engaging in over the last 4 years. I will start to give you a bit of an overview of what I will be talking about. If I get this to work, yes. So I want to situate my presentation in a larger research interest that I've been having over the last couple of years, where I've been interested in studying the digitalization of food and eating. And then I will shift more specifically to the topic of dietary tracking and expertise, which is what I will be focusing on today in this talk. And after sort of like situating this in the larger literature that I engage with for this particular presentation, I will introduce you to the research project which I've been collaborating but also leading, the so-called Food Coach project, where we developed a dietary monitoring and intervention app. And I hope it's going to be very interesting in the sense that it's based on data donation, which is not typical for a dietary tracking app. So I'll explain that a little bit later. And I will specifically then focus on what we as the social scientists in the research project have been studying, which is focusing on the development of the app. So we've been participating, but also observing how this has been done. And we've been speaking to users, but also non-users, about some of the prototypes and their thoughts and reactions to that. And what I will report on is specifically on some of the focus groups that my colleague Giada Danesi, who's been a postdoc in this project, has been doing, where a very strong theme in these focus groups was that people found it very challenging to delegate dietary expertise to an app. And I will go in a little bit more depth on what I mean by that and how we then fed that sort of like information back to our colleagues that developed the technical side of the app. So we all live now in a digital society surrounded by all sorts of services that we can request online, if it's digital food delivery or using online recipes. Some of you might happily share pictures of their food online on different platforms and give certain hashtags to them. Some might follow trends like food talk. Others could use different kinds of apps to track their food or to reduce food waste. There's a popular app that I'm showing on the right corner down here, Too Good To Go, that is helping people to reduce food waste, at least in Europe. And but it's not only the eating part of food that is increasingly digitalized and food information is turned into data, but it's also at the production level. So we see sensor-based but and also digitalized forms of growing food, or at least monitoring the growth of that food and nutrient intake. This is a sort of like wider development around digitalization of food and eating. And alongside with this development, we have seen the emergence of a new subfield, I would say, within broadly defined food studies, which is called digital food studies. So sociologists such as Deborah Lupton or Zina Feldman have talked about us living in so-called digital food cultures, videos of particular kinds of forms of eating being shared on different platforms across YouTube and Instagram or TikTok. Others, such as the media and communication scholar Tanja Lewis, have published on digital food and how it becomes digitalized from paddock to platform, and reporting about this in her book. As a while ago, my colleagues and I have also been looking at how different platforms have been used for activism around food, so that consumers use these as a tool to have their voices heard and to communicate around hashtags, but also in other ways, their issues around food, and also signal their expertise on specific topics. So this is a sort of like a wider context. And my colleague Karin Illy and I, we've been studying this topic for some time together. And what we tried to distinguish in these studies is that we said, we see a bit of a difference if we're talking about digital food or digital eating. And we distinguish these by saying that studies of digital food that focus typically either on novel food substances or on digitally enabled or data-focused production and distribution processes of foods. There can be a focus on the digitized histories, economies, trajectories of these items, but specifically studies that focus on digital food, they focus on what people eat as a result of digitized and datafied innovation. In contrast, we argue studies of digital eating, here the aim is more on understanding how people eat differently, or sometimes not. It can also be unsuccessful, and we also have studies on that. When using specific digital technologies or platforms and devices, and using that information on there. So it's studies on digital eating, they focus on novel eating practices that are enabled, maintained through mobile and sensor-based and digital technologies. And it's specifically this later focus, or the second one, the digital eating one, that I was speaking around today. So I'll be focusing on the digital technologies and how people eat differently or not when using these digital devices. In studying digital eating, and I have been very much using a perspective which comes from sociology and anthropology and science and technology studies, which is referred to as the socio-material perspective. So this is an approach that tries to avoid a dualistic perspective in which humans are positioned on one side and technologies on the other side. Instead, such an approach views humans and technologies as working together to productively generate certain types of agential capacities, so capacities to act with each other. I'm not sure if you see the actual reference. This is taken from Deborah Lupton's work, 2017, and she builds here on Bennett. So when I go through my presentation today, I think it's very important to bear this in mind, that I have this so-called social material perspective in mind, that I look at the doing of technology and humans in collaboration. To get a bit closer to the actual topic of today, there has been quite substantial research on digital health and digital tracking in the past. Several books and journal articles have been published by a range of researchers, also beyond sociology and technology and ethics, on this topic. But I want to specifically focus on what a range of different sociologists have found. Of course, this is not news to many of you who are interested in this topic. Digital tracking of food and eating has become a really widespread activity. It's become popular to monitor and improve health, not for everyone, but for certain groups in society. But this has been also problematized for the personal and social implications of digital tracking in terms of how this affects individuals. For instance, this can lead, Kent has argued, for instance, this can lead to sort of like a oversimplification and overgeneralization of health and the body. It can also lead to some sort of damaging implications, that people over-exercise, and it can affect then their well-being. There's also in some of these studies an indication towards this. There's a perversive moralism of health that is sort of coming with these applications, so that you have to always do good choices, and then there's a clear boundary of what is good eating, what is not good eating, and if you don't maintain healthy behaviors, it is perceived by users, some users, as lacking self-discipline, and also an outside look on these users who don't do it beyond the dietary tracking, one could say, comes with this view of like, okay, this person lacks self-discipline in their eating habits. So there are strong moral undertones to these tools, but also to healthy eating as a practice often. What sociologists also have talked about or pointed out, and others, is what kind of is summarized under this term metrification of food and eating. This has been around for a long time. Think of the concept of calories, but of course there's other kinds of forms of measuring food and the body and eating and how it affects people's well-being, and acts as a sort of like a governance tool for some. And then also it's important to take into account with this metrification, like nutrients, calories, and so on and so forth, different types of expertise become relevant. So historically, we've seen the growth of nutrition science, but now with this emergence of these digital tracking apps, it's tech companies that have the expertise, or startups, to develop these kinds of devices. And they often rely, of course, also on other expertise, such as nutrition expertise. But what it means is that we have new types of relevant expertise emerging in this area of dietary tracking and understanding health and food and the body. So it's important from this literature to acknowledge that there's a coexistence of multiple forms of expertise. They are also important to consider not only professional kinds of expertise that I've pointed out already with nutrition science, but also computer science, and in addition also, of course, sociological expertise, research expertise, but also lay expertise. So they all coexist around food and eating, and we take that as a sort of like a background to our study. We also draw on literature that has been advocating for a relational view of expertise. So the perspective that health-related perspective is constantly being made through and negotiated in these social material practices that I pointed out earlier. And then there's what is referred to as a constitutive entanglement of the social and the material, what Lupton refers to as human data assemblages that enact these sort of health-related expertise. So, and also to sort of point out, this is more a doing, constant performance, rather than something that people have, or viewing expertise as something that a person carries with them. It's done in concrete practices, in concrete situations, with certain technologies of food. This expertise and the different kind of coexistence of different kinds of expertises is important if we think about who do we turn to trust in terms of expertise around food. And in the case of digital tracking and dietary tracking, we also have to take into consideration the aspect of delegating expertise. So it's a tool that you have to trust, that it tells you good information, and that it helps you hopefully with figuring out what is healthy eating. But of course, the definition of healthy eating is also diverse among different people if you talk to different kinds of experts. So there is research, not specifically on dietary tracking, but more generally, that has been investigating automated and autonomous and other outsourcing technologies and also algorithmic decision making. And that has been highlighting that users of these might not wish to entirely delegate meaningful activities and decisions to technology for various reasons. So some of these reasons are listed here. These technologies are perceived to threaten a user's agency. They generate fears that non-human actors have displaced human decision-making. There's also, for some, reduced feeling of control. So it's if they're not themselves making the decision, but they are being proposed to them, it's sort of like being controlled by the technology. It also is perceived by some as a deprivation from meanings. So you associate with food, for instance, particular meanings, memories, but if you're not allowed to eat it because it's unhealthy, it deprives you of something. And also these technologies, in some cases, have been found to reduce or potentially reduce cognitive and manual abilities. So for these reasons, it's a delegation of expertise is perceived to be challenging. And this is sort of like the background of literature that we've been engaging with to understand, okay, now we come here with our research project and want to understand how do potential users, but also non-users, respond to the prospect of delegating expertise on making healthy food choices to an app. And I would now like to introduce you to the Food Coach project to give you a bit of an understanding of why we conducted this joint and interdisciplinary study and tried to address this question together. So the Food Coach project is a research project that was funded between 2020 and 2024 by the Swiss National Science Foundation as an interdisciplinary research project with colleagues from information studies, computer science, and STS, science technology study / sociology. And the focus of this call at the time was on digital health, and the project we proposed was focused on healthy food shopping and consumption. The idea behind the project, which was generated by my colleagues in computer science and information studies, was to use shopping data from two supermarkets in Switzerland. They have a market share of 70%. They're quite dominant players, but there's also other supermarkets, I should point out. And these two are Migros and Coop. And to use that data to then analyze it and to find out how the weekly shopping baskets score if you analyze it algorithmically with the so-called Nutri-Score. This is a measure to analyze how healthy your food is based on an assessment of the different food groups and taking into account the saltiness, sugar content, but also fat content of the foods. So what you see here was an initial mock-up to show you green is considered to be healthy and red not. And you can see how it gives you an image over time. And the kind of give a feedback. Congratulations, your Nutri-Score has been improving significantly, but there's also some suggestions of alternatives to certain products that you've been buying. So this was the background idea when we started out. Initially, there was also an attempt to get supermarkets to join this project. This was before it was actually, this project was submitted, but they in the end opted not to join. And so for this reason, the project opted to use customer loyalty data by data donation. I'll show you a little bit on the next slide a bit more. So based on these, we could then analyze the digital shopping receipts. And the aim was to create a so-called progressive web app where information about this shopping behavior is made available back to the user to see, okay, how healthy is my weekly eating or my shopping, and then based on that, my eating. So this is how my colleagues envisioned it, and very much also laid out this way. We have a shopping journey. You go to a supermarket, you do your shopping. Here in the lower end, you see the user are shopping at the retailer. Then they scan their loyalty card. The data is being synced at the digital receipt service. The food coach team receives the item log and the nutritional information. Then it's analyzed, and the user receives the feedback within the food coach app. So here you see a bit of a later mock-up of the food coach app, again with the Nutri-Score basket, and next to it the recommendations. These are automated recommendations. Here you see, for instance, your average Nutri-Score has been 4 weeks in C, so sort of middle range. And some recommendations are being given: how to reduce energy from sweet snacks, or how to reduce saturated fat from meat and fish. So there are some healthier products being listed here. So what's important to know about this research project is that we had different streams. So a stream on developing the technical side of things and the digital side of things, and a social science stream that was accompanying the project the whole time. And the focus was on accompanying the design and development phases by the social science team, and then also to conduct research with users and non-users, broadly defined, to understand their perspective. So really to understand motivations, intentions, drivers, barriers of these potential users and non-users in relation to developing this receipt-based nutrition monitoring. But of course, we're also interested in more broader questions in terms of understanding new or evolving norms of food and digital health. And more concretely, the social science team is, in addition to me, my colleagues Giada Danesi and at the time Aline Sternberger. She was a doctoral researcher who recently graduated, and it's been mostly Giada's data that I'll be presenting today. She's been collecting a lot of the focus group with some help of Aline, and of course we've jointly devised the studies. We were interested, we had 2 larger sub-studies in the social science team around users and non-users' meanings and practices of digital eating. The first one I will not speak about, but I can point you to a paper in which we published on this. Initially, we really wanted to get a bigger picture of how consumers in Switzerland understand eating well. And we intentionally didn't call it healthy eating. We wanted to have it a broader term, so we got broader meanings associated with food and eating, and we wanted to understand it in relation to digital platforms. So what kind of platforms do people use to inform or educate themselves, or to use devices and so on to eat well? Again, with this very broad focus in mind. And in order to understand this better, we conducted a questionnaire with 441 participants, and then also conducted follow-up interviews with some of those who had filled in the survey and volunteered to also be interviewed. And I can just maybe briefly say what we did with this data is that we conducted a cluster analysis to understand what kind of different types of eaters could we identify, and what kind of technologies, digital technologies or platforms did they engage with. And this was very informative to see for us, because there was only certain groups who would at all engage with digital tracking. It was a very sporty, athletic group amongst, and one that was very concerned around dieting and had been dieting for a longer time. But I'll point you to our publication on this, which is called More of the Same. It's published in the Journal of Cultural Economy, and you will find more details about the clusters and our findings there. But what we essentially found there is that people, when they switch or use digital platforms, they don't change their behavior significantly. They have an interest already in a specific topic, like cooking, and then when they use a digital platform, they just use, instead of a cookbook, a digital platform. And they may, of course, change a little bit what they eat, but we don't have that longitudinal data. But what we can say is that they stay within their topic of interest: dieting, cooking, communal, commensal eating, and so on and so forth. The second study, which I'll present now, is more focused, as I said, on food and expertise, specifically around the Food Coach app. So there we got closer to the app, and we conducted go-alongs. These are a form of going along with a consumer when he or she goes shopping, and to try and understand how they use or don't find this prototype that we've been showing to them and asking them to use useful. And we also then conducted focus groups after a certain time with a different kind of mock-up, with a different set of people, to understand how they reacted. Hang on, I should say maybe a bit more about the focus groups. So we recorded with the go-alongs, we did field notes, or Giada did field notes, and the focus groups were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed to understand what kind of themes we saw in this data set. So I'll talk a little bit more about this main theme that we identified. So in our analysis, we found the one of the main themes in the focus groups to be around delegating expertise to an automated system. And we found different variations of this theme. I'm listing here the 6 that we could most clearly identify. So one was around attitudes towards delegating caring work to a machine. So there was some had no problem with that. I should also point that out. They were like, great, now I don't need to think so much about it. I can ask this app, and that's helpful. But we also had strong views that didn't want this kind of caring work to be delegated to a machine. And they felt this was also, and this is speaking into the second theme, an issue of care versus control. Some said things like, I'm already so aware of all these aspects of healthy eating, and if I now also use this app, I will become totally obsessed with checking this all the time, and they rejected it for these reasons. Another sub-theme on this delegation aspect was around partial and limited personalization of the automated dietary tracking system. I will not say something about that because I want to go a bit more detailed with some quotes to illustrate it a bit further in a second. The fourth sub-theme was focused on diverse values that were at play in making healthy food choices and consuming healthy food. So here really kicked in an idea that we have as individuals very different values around food and eating. So some might have a very nutritional perspective, focusing on calories and particular ingredients in food, but others have different understandings of what they value about food and eating, and they found it problematic to delegate this because they felt there was a mismatch. with the specific app, and at least what we presented to them in the focus group in terms of mock-ups and explanations. And another interesting sub-theme was an issue of trust in the institution behind the data and the technology. So this project we conducted, it was a research project, and at the time we did not plan to develop the food coach app into a commercial viable product that then would be on the market. It was for research purposes in the sense of like, can we build the architecture? Can we make this work? And will this have an impact in terms of, will it reduce people's unhealthy eating? And also to sort of see what kind of backlash and issues would emerge. Having said that, of course, there is the possibility to further develop it, but it was really meant as a research project, open, and to share the data, the findings widely. Nonetheless, most apps that are out there are commercial apps. So anyone who participated, or let's say the majority at least, felt they had already experience with other, or at least seen or heard of other kind of apps and tracking devices. So it was very hard for them, who's behind this? And is this trustworthy? And how do sociologists and computer scientists qualify to tell us something about food? Where do you get your expertise from? What you build it on? So there was a lot of questions around that before people even were inclined to engage further. The last theme, which I'll also illustrate a little bit with some quotes, is around controversial and limited vision of nutritional standards. There was a lot of conversation in the focus group around what score had been chosen to use. So the Nutri-Score is one particular score to analyze the healthiness of food and in this case shopping data, but there's other ways to do it. And why was this one chosen? And it's of course also not a completely uncontroversial score. And some people were also a bit concerned about this strong focus on nutrition exclusively. So again, this speaks back to the topic of the diverse values. So can we not have other information also included, not only nutritional information? But I want to illustrate a little bit what the participants said in terms of partial and limited personalization of automated dietary tracking system, which I think shows quite well where some of the reservations were resting, at least in relation to this specific app. So I'm quoting here partly, and yes, Bettina. She's 50, or was at the time 55 years old, as a teacher in a continuing education school, and lives with her daughter in a small village. And what we found is that she does not believe food could work for me. This is her quote, to improve her diet because she has special needs. She's a celiac and intolerant to milk products. She would not like to delegate to anyone to decide what her household eats, because she and her daughter have very different needs and habits, but also because, that's what she says, I'm too aware of what we eat and what I need for a balanced meal, and so on and so forth, to delegate to another. So you can also sense, I would argue, some anxieties around not being the person who is in charge to make these decisions and to delegate it to an app where you don't fully understand how these suggestions come about. And you feel you have so much experience yourself now with being a celiac and intolerant to milk products, that she's quite aware of what are good products for her and her daughter. Speaking a bit more about the controversial and limited vision of nutritional standards, there was, here we have Tobias, who's 60 years old. He said in the focus group, my question would be, if you look at the experts of diets, there are so many experts and they all have contrary advice. One says reduce carbohydrates, the others say do that, and so on. They're quite contradictory. So how do you integrate this in this system? So again, he's saying there's different kinds of expertises, and you focus on this Nutri-Score, but there's more, and how do you bring it all in? So he's really concerned about food coach making a choice on which diet one should opt for. Another illustration of this sub-theme is here by Mia. She's 55 years old at the time. She's also aware of conflicts between different food regimes and logic behind eating and dieting. And in her view, there are an incredible number of competing food philosophies, ideologies, diets, or whatever she says. And it's crucial to know according to which you are defining and evaluating good food choices. So some want low carb, the next vegan, the next but one lacto something, the next find paleo great, and so on. So she sort of describes these competing values and emphasizes mainly their difference rather than whether they're actually correct or incorrect and how they need to be taken into account. This brings me already to my conclusion, and I'm then very happy to take questions and give more details and answer them. So we really found a strong challenge around delegating dietary expertise in relation to the development of the Food Coach app. We think it was very important as part of the project to take serious the views, discourses, and practices of users and non-users of dietary tracking apps in this development, so that we engaged with them and also to understand how this expertise was being remade in the process. We have colleagues who have written about practice conflicts of when integrating new digital platforms into everyday routines. But we would argue this goes beyond practice conflicts, but also beyond concerns of privacy and trust. They are certainly present in our data. We can certainly point to all of these. But it's also a pushback against the limits of datafication and metrication, specifically around the Nutri-Score we at least experienced in our focus group. What our participants emphasized is what is neglected in the process of developing this type of system that enables dietary tracking, which is mainly their own dietary, but also bodily and social-cultural expertise, and what is good for them. And there are significant others. So if you think back to the example I gave you about the celiac, for instance. So what we see here is what Screeners has called nutritionism, this sort of like strong focus on nutrients when we're talking about food and eating, and pushing for a broader practice of nutrition and eating. But it is actually very difficult to capture that in such a digital device or app and system, which in some ways has to rely on scoring and algorithmically understanding what is healthy and unhealthy. But this was something our participants found problematic and pushed back. And I should again say, it was not all of them, but it was the majority in our focus groups. If you are finding this interesting, of course, please engage with me in questions around this, but we've also just 2 days ago published an article specifically on our focus group data. We called it Automating Dietary Expertise, the challenge of making a food tracking app for everyone. And it's open access in the journal Medicine, Anthropology and Theory. And I hope you will have a read. We have more details there, but again, I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.